highway back to Maplewood always looked the same in November. Flat gray sky, flat gray fields, the kind of landscape that made you feel like the world had quietly given up. I hadn't been back in almost 3 years. My hands were steady on the wheel. My chest wasn't. I told myself this trip was for my stepmother, that she called and said my father's retirement dinner was something I shouldn't miss, that it would be good for the family. I told myself a lot of things over the years about what was good for the family. The town looked exactly as I remembered it, which was somehow worse than if it had changed. Same Tim Hortons on the corner of Main and Rideau, same hardware store with the hand-painted sign, same Legion Hall where my father had spent more weekend evenings than he ever spent at home. I pulled into the parking lot of the motel on the edge of town. I hadn't asked to stay at the house, my stepmother hadn't offered, and sat in the car for a minute with the engine idling, watching the exhaust curl up into the cold. I should explain what I was coming back to. My father retired from the RCMP after 32 years. He was a good officer. Everyone in Maplewood said so. They said it the way small towns say things about men like him, with the kind of certainty that doesn't leave room for complication. He was good, he was steady, he served. What happened inside the house on Birchwood Road was something the town didn't need to know about, and so it didn't. My mother left when I was 11. I don't blame her. My stepmother, Vera, came into the picture when I was 13, and within a year I understood that I was not going to be her project. I was going to be her reminder of what came before her, and she was going to treat me accordingly. Not cruelly, not in ways that left marks anyone could see. Just consistently, quietly, in the way a person lets a door close without holding it open for the person behind them. Every single time for years, until you stop expecting the door to stay open. I left for university in Halifax when I was 17, a scholarship to Dalhousie. I didn't come home for the first Christmas. My father called once in January to ask why. I told him I'd had to work. It wasn't entirely a lie. After Dal, I went into public health, epidemiology specifically, infectious disease surveillance and outbreak response. I did my master's at McGill, then went to work for the Public Health Agency of Canada. Within 4 years, I was leading a regional response team based out of Ottawa. I was 29. I was good at the work in the way that people who have learned to be very quiet and very precise become good at things, methodically, without announcing themselves. I didn't tell my father about any of it in detail. I told him I worked for the government. He told Vera, and Vera told the people she knew, which was everyone in Maplewood. And somehow the story that circulated was that I worked in some kind of clerical capacity, a desk job. Something safe and small, which was, I think, exactly what Vera needed me to be in the story she told about our family. When she called to invite me to the retirement dinner, she mentioned it almost in passing. Natalie's coming too, just so you know. Natalie was her daughter from her first marriage. Natalie, who had stayed local, who had married the son of the regional manager at the bank, who had given my father 2 grandchildren he adored in a way he'd never quite managed to adore me. Natalie was not the problem. Natalie had always just been present in a way that made my absence more obvious. I said I'd come. I booked the motel. I packed one nice dress and a blazer, and I drove 9 hours from Ottawa without stopping except for gas and a coffee I didn't finish. The retirement dinner was held at the Legion, which was fitting. The place had been renovated since I was a teenager. New flooring, better lighting, a proper sound system, but it still smelled the same. Floor wax and old wood and something faintly metallic that I'd never been able to identify. I arrived early because I didn't know how else to arrive. I signed the guest book at the door. There were name tags on a table near the entrance. I found mine and saw that Vera had used my childhood nickname, Mel. I hadn't been Mel to anyone in 15 years. I put the tag on anyway. The room filled up. Officers in dress uniform, some retired, some still active, town councilors, old family friends, people who remembered me from before I left and greeted me with the particular warmth of people who don't quite know what happened but know that something did. I smiled and said it was good to be back, and I meant it about 40%. My father looked older. He was 61, but he'd become one of those men who age quickly after 50, the kind of aging that comes from decades of shift work and bad coffee and a body that absorbed stress without ever releasing it. He hugged me at the door, quick and slightly awkward, and said, "Glad you made it." Vera was beside him in a wine-colored dress and the particular expression she wore at official functions. Pleasant, composed, subtly surveying. She squeezed my hand and said, "You look tired, sweetheart." I said I'd had a long drive. She nodded, like that confirmed something. Dinner was roast beef and potatoes, the kind of meal that exists outside of time in Canadian banquet halls. I sat at the family table with Vera, Natalie, and her husband Craig, my father's brother from Red Deer, and two of my father's former colleagues whose names I kept forgetting and having to relearn. I ate. I asked questions about people I'd lost track of. I listened to Craig tell a story about a highway patrol incident from 1987 that he'd apparently told at every family gathering since 1987. It was during dessert that it started. Vera was talking to the woman on her left, the wife of the regional RCMP commander, about Natalie's work. Natalie managed the community programs at the rec center and was, by every account, genuinely good at it. Vera talked about it with the particular pride she reserved for things that reflected well on her. And then the woman asked, politely, what I did. There was a pause, brief, but not accidental. Mel works for the federal government, Vera said. Some kind of data work, I think. She glanced at me with what looked like a helpful smile. She's always been very private about it. I said, public health, outbreak response mostly. The woman nodded, interested. Oh, like with the agency? PHAC? Yes, I said. Vera said, with a small laugh, it's basically like being a scientist, except they mostly just look at spreadsheets. Very important spreadsheets. She patted my hand. Mel was always so detail-oriented, even as a little girl. The woman smiled politely and moved on. I looked at the slice of lemon cake on my plate. After dessert, when the tables were being cleared and people were standing in clusters, Vera found me near the bar. She was carrying a glass of wine and wearing the look she wore when she decided to be honest for my benefit. Can I say something? She said, which meant she was going to say it regardless. Of course. I think it's wonderful that you've made something of yourself in Ottawa. She said Ottawa the way people from small towns sometimes say the names of cities, with faint skepticism, like the place itself was slightly suspect. But you've been away a long time. Your dad needed support these last few years and you just weren't here. Natalie was. I think sometimes you don't realize what your absence looks like to people. I looked at her. What does it look like? Like you couldn't be bothered, she said pleasantly. Like your career was more important than your family. I didn't say anything. There were things I could have said. I could have told her about the 3 times in 4 years I'd been deployed to outbreak response situations. Once to a remote community in northern Ontario, once to a situation in BC that I still couldn't discuss in detail. Once to a coordinating role during a public health emergency that had kept me working 20-hour days for 2 months. I could have told her what those deployments cost, not in any way that was heroic, just in practical terms, the relationships I hadn't been able to sustain, the things I'd missed, the costs of doing work that you believe in when the work keeps asking more of you. I didn't say any of it. I said, I understand, and I went to get a glass of water. The formal part of the evening began around 8. The regional RCMP commander spoke. The town mayor spoke. There were plaques and a shadow box of my father's service medals and a framed photo of him in uniform from his early years that made him look like a different person, or maybe just the same person before time had worked on him. My father stood at the podium and gave a short speech that was genuinely moving, about service, about community, about the people who'd been beside him. He thanked Vera at length. He mentioned Natalie and her children by name. He looked at the family table once and said, "My family has been my foundation." I was at the family table. I thought that counted. I was at the back of the room when it happened. I'd stepped away from the table to stand near the wall. I'd always been someone who needed to see the whole room, an occupational habit, when I noticed the man who just walked in. He was in his early 50s, in civilian dress but wearing the kind of bearing that doesn't come off with a uniform. I recognized the face before I placed the name Dr. Elliot Marsh, the Chief Public Health Officer of the PHAC Regional Office for Eastern Ontario, which technically made him 2 levels above me in the chain of command. We'd worked together closely during the Northern Ontario response. He lived in the area, I'd known that vaguely, and I realized he must have come because of my father, because in a town this size, the RCMP retirement of a 32-year officer was the kind of event that crossed professional circles. He came in, scanned the room, and found me immediately. "There you are," he said, and shook my hand with both of his. "I was hoping you'd be here. I heard it was your father's night." I said yes, and we started talking quietly about nothing consequential, the drive, the venue, the fact that we were both clearly surviving dessert. And then Vera appeared. She'd seen him come in. She'd seen him find me. She approached with her wine glass and her pleasant face and the authority of a woman in her own territory, and she extended her hand and said, "Hi, I'm Vera. You must be a colleague of my husband's." "No," he said, smiling. "I'm a colleague of your daughter's." Vera looked at me and then back at him, and I watched her recalibrate. "Oh, from the government office." "From PHAC, yes." He said it with the easy comfort of someone who doesn't know he's clarifying anything. "Your daughter runs our outbreak response operations for the region. She's, genuinely, I want to say this properly, she's one of the most capable people working in public health in this country right now. We were just discussing in Ottawa last week whether she'd consider a national director role." The room was not silent. People were still talking and laughing, and the sound system was playing something low in the background. But in the small circle around us, there was a particular stillness. Vera said, "Oh, just that." He looked at me with the cheerful obliviousness of a man who has genuinely no idea what dynamics he has just walked into. "I was actually glad to run into you here. I wanted to ask you in person. The Geneva consultation in February, the WHO Working Group on Early Warning Systems, we'd like you to lead the Canadian delegation. We think you're the right person. You don't have to decide tonight, obviously." I said I'd think about it. My voice was completely steady, which surprised me. He said something kind about my father's service, wished us both a good evening, and went to find the bar. Vera stood with her wine glass. She was looking at the middle distance, at something that wasn't quite the room. I didn't say anything. I'd learned a long time ago that the best responses to moments like this were not the ones you made in the moment. My father had been standing close enough to hear. I didn't know exactly how much he'd caught. The room was noisy and he'd been talking to someone. But when I turned, I found him looking at me. Not with the expression of a man who'd just realized he'd made a series of failures over 30 years. People don't work that quickly. It was something more like the expression of a man who had just been handed information that he hadn't known how to ask for and wasn't sure yet what it meant. He said quietly, "National Director." I said, "I haven't decided." He looked at his hands for a moment. Then he said, "You should have told me." And I thought, you should have asked. But I didn't say it, because some sentences are just for you, and this was one of them. What I said was, "I'm telling you now, I guess." He nodded slowly. The sound of the room came back in around us. Laughter from the bar, the scrape of chairs, someone's grandkid running across the floor in dress shoes that were too big. Natalie found us a few minutes later, and the conversation moved to other things, and I stayed for another hour because the evening wasn't finished, and I wasn't the kind of person who left early anymore. I said goodbye to people I wouldn't see again for another 3 years. I hugged my father at the coat check, longer than the hug at the door, and he held on for an extra second in a way that felt like the beginning of something, or maybe just the acknowledgement that something had needed to begin. Vera said goodnight from across the lobby. We waved at each other. It was the most honest exchange we'd had in 20 years. I drove back to the motel along roads that had no streetlights, just the white lines and whatever the headlights caught. Frost on the grass, a stop sign, a mailbox shaped like a barn that I remembered from childhood. The radio found a country station out of Belleville, something slow and a little sad, and I let it play. I wasn't angry exactly. I wasn't triumphant either. It would be dishonest to pretend that the look on Vera's face hadn't reached something in me that had been waiting a long time to be reached. But what I actually felt, alone in the car on that dark road, was something more like quiet. Not the quiet of someone who has won something. The quiet of someone who has stopped needing to explain herself and realized, somewhere between the coat check and the highway, that she probably stopped needing to quite some time ago and just hadn't noticed. The motel room was clean and cold. I turned up the heat and sat on the edge of the bed and texted my closest friend in Ottawa, just survived. Driving home tomorrow, and she sent back 3 emojis that were exactly right. I don't know what Vera said to my father that night, or what he said back. I don't know if she's recalibrated the story she tells about me, or if she's found a way to fold the information into the existing narrative with minimal disruption. People are resourceful that way, especially people who spent decades building a particular version of the world. I know my father called me 3 weeks later. Not to talk about the evening. We didn't talk about it directly, maybe we never will, but just to call, to ask how the drive back had been, to ask about work in a way that felt like he actually wanted to know the answer. We talked for 40 minutes, which was longer than any call we'd had in the previous 5 years. He asked about Geneva. I told him what I could. It wasn't a reconciliation. It wasn't the beginning of a repaired relationship shaped like the ones in movies, where the estranged daughter comes home and everything gets said and everyone softens in the right ways at the right moments. Real things don't often work like that. Real things work slowly and sideways, and you don't always know if they're working until much later. But he called, and I answered, and we stayed on the line. That part, at least, was true, and for now, it was enough. I thought a lot about that moment at the coat check, the way the room kept going around us while something small and significant quietly shifted. Not dramatically, not the way it happens in the stories we tell ourselves when we're younger and still believe that justice arrives loudly. What I keep coming back to is this. Vera wasn't wrong about everything. I had been absent. I had let years pass without fighting harder to be known by the people who were supposed to know me. Part of that was self-protection, and part of it was just the slow accumulation of giving up on conversations that never seemed to go anywhere. I'd told myself that doing the work was enough. That being good at something, quietly and without announcement, was its own kind of answer. And in some ways it was. But there's a version of integrity that tips into avoidance if you're not careful, and I had been living in that version for a long time. The thing about doing hard work in silence is that it builds something real, but it doesn't automatically build understanding between people. Dr. Marsh didn't walk into that Legion Hall intending to change anything. He was just being honest, the way people are when they have no idea a room has a history. And that honesty did more in 30 seconds than any argument I could have made over 20 years. Not because the truth was new, but because I'd never let it be said out loud in a room where my father was standing. I think about the version of me who left Maplewood at 17. She was determined, and she was hurt, and she was smart enough to know that the only way forward was to become undeniable. What she didn't know, what took me another 15 years to understand, was that being undeniable isn't the same as being known. You can build a career that speaks for itself and still have the people closest to you operating on a story that stopped updating in 2009. That gap doesn't close on its own. It takes something. Sometimes it takes a stranger walking into a Legion Hall in Eastern Ontario. What stayed with me most wasn't Dr. Marsh's words, or the look on Vera's face, or even the second longer hug at the coat check. It was my father's voice, 3 weeks later on the phone, careful, a little uncertain, asking about Geneva like he was learning a new language and wasn't sure he was pronouncing it right. That effort. That small, imperfect reaching toward something that should have happened years ago. It mattered to me more than I expected it to. I don't think people change easily or completely. I think they shift, occasionally, when something real breaks through the version of the world they've been living in. My father shifted. Maybe just a few degrees. But a few degrees, held over time, can change where you end up entirely. What I know now is that the discipline I'd poured into my work, the years of hard calls, the deployments, the 20-hour days, the accumulated weight of getting things right when it mattered, that discipline had a cost I didn't always name honestly. It asked me to keep my head down, and keeping your head down is a skill that protects you, but it also keeps you small in the eyes of people who can only see what you show them. The road back to Ottawa was dark and long, and the radio played something I didn't know. And somewhere past Belleville, I stopped needing the evening to mean more than it did. It was one dinner, one conversation, one man who walked in at the right moment and said a true thing. That was enough to start with.